It's great to be here. Thank you very much. Marius, thanks for establishing the connection. Marius is an old friend and colleague of the Department of Philosophy. So I've been thinking about corruption in South Africa for quite a few years. And it started with a conversation I had with Tabensky. He's not my friend. We met once, and I had the chance to ask him a question. And he answered in a way that I thought was admirable, coming from a very philosophical, in fact, very Socratic. He was talking about corruption on the continent, not just on, as you know, he was a Pan-Africanist. I believe that Pan-Africanism, some version of Pan-Africanism, is an ideal way to go. It's not happening, and he was complaining it's not happening because of incredibly corrupt leadership across the continent. And I asked him, well, why? Why is it that there's so much corruption on the continent? And he said, I don't know. That's the Socratic moment. And I really like that, because this is a man who spent a lot of time talking to people. He knows a lot about the continent, a lot more than I do, a lot more than most people do, certainly about leadership, and he just doesn't know. And that got me thinking. The same night I had a chance to talk to Alec Irwin. He was part of the Mandela cabinet, I guess, and he spoke in a way that I thought was really interesting, and respect him for it. He said, the mistake we made in '94. The mistake we made in '94, he says, is that we took all the talent, all the people who were really committed to democracy, we put them in Pretoria, and we left a vacuum in all the municipalities, in the ANC branches, etc. And that allowed for the hustlers, I'm using my language now, to come in, and I'll talk a little bit about the hustlers, to come into government, eventually with Zuma just fully take over. And that was another moment. So why do people become hustlers? This is a question I was asking. And so I was happy to share my ideas. I also had a chance to be in a panel very recently with Njabulun Ndebele, who's a very thoughtful man, applied with Mandela. He was VC of 2 universities. As I found out, he was one of the authors with Anki Krog of the preamble to our constitution. So he's been very involved, but I also know that he never really joined the ANC. He was apparently in exile at some point. He had the opportunity of joining, but he didn't think things were very nice then. And we're not going to talk about that. But he gave a story that is very similar to the hypothesis that I was building. So this is more evidence that maybe there's something happening. And I've tested this idea with lots of people. Trevor Manuel was there. He also agreed, right? So, and then I tested the idea with on another panel, and Tendi Nkadimeng was in it. She's the current minister, I can't remember which one. And she also agreed. So there's something happening. Now the story I'm going to give you is not a complete account. There are other things that have to do with the history, I think, of the ANC in exile and what was happening there. Paul Truella talks about this very interestingly, and other people as well. But I'm not going to get into that. I don't think we need to for the purposes of talking about what's basic. Another thing I want to say is, I don't think that corruption is special to the African continent. It's a feature of all societies. If you go to the US, the lobby groups, very elegant and sophisticated forms of corruption, right? I don't think the US is a democracy, really. It's corporate interest driving the game, and the immense power that the media has to manipulate human minds. So corruption's everywhere. Wherever you go, you'll find corrupt people. But there's a particular sort of corruption that is affecting our continent, and that is a corruption that is incredibly self-destructive. It's a corruption where the corrupt people destroy the very ground upon which corruption happens. That's a bit of the background. And so what happened? So I'm Jewish. In the introduction, I have a history with my grandfather was in a concentration camp. The only story I've heard from him, the only story that was told is that he somehow got hold of a bit of fat. How he got that? He was a tailor. My guess is that he got it for doing something that's, tailors were very prized among the Nazis, I guess. They liked to dress nicely when they were killing. So he had it. But he went to bed and he woke up in the morning and the fat wasn't there anymore. So let me talk a little bit about what happened in concentration camps. and compare that with what happens in colonized countries, where people who have been colonized are treated like garbage. So I'm going to quote a few people. I'm going to start by quoting Primo Levi. I think Primo Levi is wonderful. Is This a Man? It's just a magnificent book. And what I really like about him is his ruthless honesty about what was happening in concentration camps. Now, it's very nice to imagine that the victims are nice people. The victims of oppression are nice people, and they behave really nicely, and they engage in a project of solidarity. They love each other, kumbaya. It wasn't like that. What happens immediately is people start hustling. And I hope that the idea of hustling becomes clear as well, because there are different interpretations of hustling. I find it very interesting, for example, that the word hustling among my students at Rhodes University is a positive term, you know. And I find that interesting in wording. So let me read Primo Levi. But we would observe that in our time, in all countries that have been invaded by foreign people, an analogous condition of rivalry and hatred among the subjugated has been established. Look what he's doing. He's comparing, what he's doing here is he's comparing his experience in the Holocaust, in Auschwitz more specifically, with colonized countries. And this, like many other human characteristics, could be grasped in the lager. The lager is his term for concentration camp, with crude force, right? So these are not, so what was happening in the lagers when, but let me just say, so let me compare this with another quote. This is a quote from Frantz Fanon, from The Wretched of the Earth, where he does the opposite. He compares what happens in colonized countries with concentration camps. I thought this was lovely kind of to show these together and how that works. So let me quote Fanon's words. Yes, during the colonial period in Algeria and elsewhere, a lot of things can be committed for a few pounds of semolina. One can kill. You need to use your imagination to understand these things, or your memory. In the concentration camps, men killed each other for a morsel of bread. I can recall one horrible scene. It was in Oran in 1944 when he was a soldier fighting in the French army in exile. From the military camp where we were waiting to embark, the soldiers threw bits of bread to some Algerian children who fought for them in a frenzy of rage and hatred. A veterinarian, who is comparing now these kids with the behavior of animals, could no doubt explain these events in terms of the famous pecking order, noted in farmyards where the corn is bitterly fought over. The strongest birds gobble up all the grain, while the less aggressive grow visibly thinner. Any colony tends to become one vast farmyard, one vast concentration camp. There he is, one vast concentration camp, where the only law is that of the knife. So, what's happening here? People are put in situations where they're forced, right, to make choices. There's another case, a story, the book is called The Cap, I haven't read it yet, but the story is basically this young man is raped and by a SS officer, and his cap is taken away. So this is a very significant thing, because if you don't have a cap when it's roll call in the morning, you're dead. You just dead. They'll just kill you right there. You have to have your cap. So he stole someone's cap, and that person died instead of him. And these are the choices that people make when in situations of scarcity. This is the politics of hunger and the politics of desperation. And a few things happen with people who are put in those situations. Well, and I'm going to read a quote from Primo Levi again, just to give you a sense of the sort of mindset that sets in when you're desperate. But things are different in the lager. Here the struggle, lager again, a concentration camp. But here the struggle to survive is without respite, because everyone is desperately and ferociously alone. Now that's a feature of the concentration camp, and I think it's a feature of life in extreme poverty. I'm not saying that this is always the case, but it's typically the case. You will find in concentration camps counterexamples, but it's not the typical counter. You'll find in townships, you will find a similar situation where there are some loving families, but for the most part, I think people feel desperately and ferociously alone. If some null aus, it's a German word, Sen something, which is a young man who in Auschwitz lingo has lost his will to live. In other words, he's a young Muslim, which is another Auschwitz term, someone who's just given up and is waiting to die. Doesn't really even care if he's going to die. He's basically a living corpse anyway. He finds no one to extend a hand. On the contrary, someone will knock him aside because it is in no one's interest that there be one more Muslim dragging himself to work every day. Just a pain. If I have to work with a Muslim, it's going to mean that I'm going to have to work twice as hard, and I don't have any energy because I'm starving and I'm just bones and flesh. So what am I going to do? I don't want this guy next to me. And if someone, by a miracle of savage patience and cunning, finds a new expedient for avoiding the hardest work, a new art that yields him an ounce of bread, and this was happening a lot. It's a kind of perverse entrepreneurialism. He will try to keep the method secret. Again, he's desperately alone, he's trying to survive. He's found a particular way of, one of the things that was done is gold was extracted from the bodies of people who just were killed in the gas chambers, and that gold was then sold to corrupt SS officers or to a capo, and then sold out of town, and then that could be exchanged for cigarettes or things of that sort. Lots of these methods were happening all the time. Prostitution, there were brothels in the concentration camps. You were a young boy or a young woman. How do you make your living? Well, you've got a body. That's one thing that you can sell for a morsel of bread to continue to be alive. Sugar daddy, sugar babe phenomenon in South Africa. So he'll keep the method secret, and he will be esteemed and respected for this, and will drive from it an exclusive and personal benefit. He will become stronger, and so will be feared. And he who is feared is ipso facto a candidate for survival. Right, so again, you're put in a situation, the politics that I'm talking about is the politics of hunger. You put people in situations, the politics of scarcity, and that creates a mindset. A mindset of solitude, a mindset of anything goes, and a breakdown of a moral order, and a sense that it's me against the world. And I think that's at the heart of being a hustler. Another feature that happens in concentration camps, and it happened, I think, in South Africa, is a lowering of self-esteem. Steve Biko talks about the inferiority complex of the black man. Fanon talks about that, the superiority complex of the white man, and the inferiority complex of the black man. When you're treated, when you're on the bottom of the pecking order, you feel like garbage. And the same happened in concentration camps. You can imagine how you would feel if you've been shaven, you're just skin and bone, you have no strength, you've been humiliated on a daily basis. You forget about hygiene. The places you go to the toilet are unspeakable. This all starts to break you down. The difference with the concentration camp and with a country like South Africa or the continent as a whole is that this lasted a few years and it was over. In South Africa, it lasted many, many generations, and it became a habit of mind. And I think that's one of the fundamental things that's having an impact. Low self-esteem. Think of the Isikotani. I don't know if you know the Isikotani. Isikotani are these people who have no money but spend thousands of money, typically from their families, on expensive shoes, burn money, throw custard on the ground, and all to show to their neighbors that they're awesome, that they're better than, that they count as someone. And it's all connected to symbols of value that are typically white. The top Isikotane, and 5 minutes? Yeah. Okay. The typical Isikotane, I would say the most accomplished Isikotane is Kene Kunene. So Kene Kunene is, well, he's a rubbish politician, and he probably will never get anywhere with it. He's come out of jail. But that's what's important is that the features that I'm talking about are not features that are exclusive to politicians. They're a feature of society, right? And they're a feature of society that, and again, I'm not saying that white people aren't corrupt. The corruption's there, the corruption is global, it's everywhere. But the corruption that's destructive, right? A feature of concentration camp living is it's hand to mouth. You need to eat today because you might not be alive tomorrow. And the feature of I think of living in extreme poverty is the same thing. You're humiliated. You're living for the next day. There's no horizon of if I do this and this and this, then in a year or two something good would happen, right? And I think this is one of the things that accounts for the self-destructive nature of the sort of corruption that is present in the continent compared to the sort of corruption that one finds elsewhere in the world. Or in South Africa. We shouldn't forget that the people who, in South Africa has an enormous, some of our politicians have an enormous thirst to be bribed. They're very keen to be bribed, but there's a briber as well. And not all bribers are South African. There's French arms manufacturers, there's the global industrial complex, very keen to offer bribes. But those are people that are they're not, the people who are bribing are not the people that are, they're not thinking, I'm going to let France go under. They're thinking big time. This is going to last. I want this company to last forever. I want to make a lot of money for a lot of time, for a long time. It's not about what's going to happen. It's not the sort of immediacy of now I have money, now I'm going to spend it, I'm going to show off. Because I have such a low self-esteem, I have to show off a la Kene Kunene, Kanyumbao, etc. You choose your celebrity who's. And so what I find also interesting in the concentration camp, again from Primo Levi, which I think is a feature of life in extreme poverty in South Africa, becomes a habit, so even when you have money, the habit carries on of the hustler. We now invite the reader, this is Primo Levi again, we now invite the reader to contemplate the possible meaning of the logger of the words good and evil, just and unjust. Let each judge on the basis of the picture outlined and the examples given above how much of our ordinary moral world would survive on this side of the barbed wire. So that I think is also important. It's a breakdown of a moral order. There's no sense of me working with others. I'm desperately alone. I have a low self-esteem. I want to prove myself. I'm desperate to prove myself. I'll do whatever I can to live. If once I get this stuff, I'm going to get this stuff and I'm going to be desperate to spend it and show everyone how great I am. And that's a sort of story. So I'm telling you what I think is a very dark story. But it's important that we understand that if we're going to start to think clearly about a way out of the mess. And so, how do I, as a prisoner in a concentration camp, try to live my life in a way that doesn't lead me to become just another hustler? How do I live in South Africa in a way that doesn't allow me to just become another hustler? And I think I've got a partial story. I should say, just as a final note, that this is not just about the politicians. I see this in my students at Rhodes University, stronger every year. Rhodes has changed from what was predominantly a white university to what is predominantly a black working class university, and far too many of my students have no interest whatsoever in being at university. None. And what they're doing is they're hustling. They're hustling their way. They saw a way of getting money, probably through NISPAS, and I can tell you a little bit more about this. But also the kids are under enormous pressure, and this is part of connected to the solitude thing, from their families to get them out of poverty. And I think that relationship, you can think of it in two ways. That's a nice expression of Ubuntu. I think that's a myth, or increasingly becoming a myth. I think it's an expression of a transactional relationship. You are the ticket. You are my ticket out of poverty. You go to university. You got the relevant score, matric results. You go to university. You go get out of there as quickly as possible and make us the money. An example, and I'll just finish with this example, is at the beginning of this year I asked my students, you have an option. Imagine you have the following option. You come into university, you go and you do the normal thing that students do. You study. You pretend to study. You stay there for a few years. The other option is you go into a room and you get certified. You just get the degree, bang, right there. You can walk out certified. About 50% of my students chose that option. And I think that just says says that's the mindset that we need to fight against. Thank you.